The torches guttered sideways in the rain as Urzoth Earthshaker planted her boot on the treaty table and refused to move. "I will not put my mark on parchment while I stand like a dog at a feast," she said, and her voice rolled across the crossroads courtyard like distant thunder, deep enough that the hanging lanterns of the crossroads bell seemed to shiver on their chains. 6 human councilmen sat behind the long oak table that had been dragged out into the open square for the occasion, their chairs carved and cushioned, their names already lettered onto little brass plaques. There was no 7th chair. There was no 7th place at all, only a gap of bare, rain-slicked cobblestone where the Orc Envoy was apparently meant to stand for the duration of a treaty that would decide the fate of 2 peoples. "Envoy Earthshaker," said Magistrate Corwin Hale, his voice pitched too high for the authority he was trying to project. "There is no precedent for—" "There is no precedent," Urzoth cut in, "for peace between our peoples at all, and yet here we stand pretending to make one." She did not shout. She did not need to. Her presence alone had already silenced the crowd that had gathered 3 deep around the courtyard. Villagers and travelers and off-duty guardsmen pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath the dripping eaves of the tavern, all of them come to watch history happen, or catastrophe, whichever arrived first. She was a mountain given the shape of a woman, and a beautiful one at that, though beauty was a strange word to use for something so obviously dangerous. Her skin held the deep green-gray of river stone after rain, and her dark hair was drawn back in thick braids threaded with small iron rings and beads of pale bone, warriors' ornaments, each one earned rather than bought. She wore fitted travel leathers the color of old bark, laced snug from throat to hip over a bodice reinforced with studs of hammered bronze, the leather molded close to broad shoulders, and a powerful, curved frame that no amount of armor could disguise as anything other than strongly, unmistakably female. A fur-trimmed cloak hung from one shoulder, thrown back to free her sword arm, and twin tusks curved up from her lower jaw, pale as ivory, framing a mouth currently set into a line of pure, immovable will. Amber eyes swept the table, the empty space beside it, and the 6 frightened, furious men who thought a scrap of parchment could buy peace without paying it any respect. "A seat," she said, "or I will consider this treaty already broken, and I will ride back to my clan tonight and tell them the humans have not changed at all." The crowd murmured. Somewhere near the back, a woman gasped as though Urzoth had drawn a blade. Magistrate Hale's face went the color of curdled milk, and his hands fluttered uselessly over the parchment as if he might smooth the crisis away with his palms. "There simply was not time to commission," he began. "Then commission it now," Urzoth said. "Or I will stand here in the rain until one of your carpenters remembers his trade." It was at that moment, from somewhere in the press of onlookers near the flour cart, that Amos Rhodes set down the sack of grain he had been carrying to the tavern kitchen, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked toward the table. He was not a large man, not next to her, not next to most men either. Years at the mill had given him a miller's build, thick through the forearms and shoulders from wrestling grain sacks and stubborn millstones, but he stood a full head shorter than the Orc Envoy, and carried none of the gilded authority the councilmen wore like borrowed coats. His hair was sandy brown, cropped short for practicality, his face weathered by sun and flour dust and long nights listening to the turning of his wheel. He was, by every measure the village of Crossmill used to judge a man, entirely unremarkable. 29 years old, unmarried, keeper of the mill his family had run for 2 generations, the kind of man people nodded to in passing and then forgot they had seen. He walked past the councilmen's table, past the startled guards who half raised their spears before recognizing him and lowering them again, and into the tavern itself. A moment later he came back out through the bell's front door, carrying over one shoulder a heavy oak chair from the private dining room, the one the innkeeper reserved for wealthy merchants passing through on market days. It was not a throne. It was not even as fine as the councilmen's seats, but it was solid, high-backed, dry beneath its coat of rain, and he set it down at the empty place beside the table with a thud that rang out across the suddenly silent courtyard. "There's your seat," Amos said. Every eye in the square turned to him. Magistrate Hale sputtered something about order and propriety. One of the guards took a half-step forward as though to seize him, uncertain whether he had just witnessed an act of treason or common sense. Urzoth Earthshaker said nothing at all for 3 long heartbeats. She only looked at the chair, and then at the man who had brought it, this small, plain, flour-dusted man who had not asked anyone's permission before doing the one obvious thing none of the powerful men at the table had thought, or dared, to do. "That is not the finest chair in this town," she said finally. "No," Amos agreed, "but it's the one I could carry." Something shifted in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but stood very close to one. She stepped around the table, set her hand upon the high back of the chair, testing its weight, and then lowered herself into it with the unhurried grace of a queen accepting a throne that had been rightfully hers all along. "It will do," she said, "for tonight." The councilmen exhaled as one. Someone in the crowd began to clap uncertainly at first, and then the rain seemed to swallow whatever protest anyone might have raised, because the envoy of the Ashfang clan had a seat at the table at last, and the treaty talks, against every expectation, could finally begin. Amos did not linger to be thanked. He never expected thanks for anything. It was not why he had done it. He turned to retreat back into the crowd, back toward his flour sacks and his unremarkable life, when a voice like warm stone stopped him. "Miller." He turned back. Urzoth Earthshaker was watching him with an intensity that made his chest feel suddenly too small for his heart. "You know my trade?" he asked, startled. "I know flour dust when I smell it," she said, "and I know a man who does not wait to be told what is right before he does it. That is rarer than either of us would like to admit." She inclined her head, the iron rings in her braids clicking softly together. "I will remember your face, Miller." "Amos," he said before he could think better of it. "Amos Rhodes. Amos Rhodes." She said his name slowly, as though tasting it, as though deciding whether it deserved to be kept. "Urzoth Earthshaker. Do not forget it either." He did not think in that moment that he ever could. The village of Crossmill had not always been so desperate for a treaty. Before the border wars had closed the eastern road, grain wagons had rolled through 3 times a week, farmers from a dozen outlying homesteads bringing their harvest to Rhodes Mill to be ground, and the great water wheel turning day and night on the mill race had been, in every meaningful sense, the beating heart that kept the whole Crossroads town alive. Travelers stopped at the Crossroads bell because there was flour to be bought and bread to be baked. Merchants stopped because the mill meant a working town, and a working town meant trade. But the war with the Ashfang clan and the smaller raiding bands that rode beneath no banner at all had strangled the eastern road for going on 6 years. And now the wheel at Rhodes Mill turned slower, fed by smaller and smaller harvests, and the tavern's rooms sat empty more nights than not, and the whole Crossroads held its breath waiting to see whether this treaty, cobbled together after a bloody stalemate neither side could afford to continue, would hold. Amos knew what failure would mean better than most of the men at that table. He had watched his father grind grain until his hands could no longer close around the hopper crank, had taken up the trade himself at 19 when there had still been enough business to justify it, and had spent the last 3 years watching the ledger book grow thinner and thinner as the war ate away at everything the mill depended upon. If the treaty failed, the road stayed closed. If the road stayed closed, the harvests kept shrinking, and eventually there would be no reason for a miller in Crossmill at all. So he had come to the courtyard that evening not out of any grand political conviction, only because the innkeeper had asked him to help carry supplies for the treaty feast, and he had stayed to watch because everyone in town was watching, and he had acted because it had simply never occurred to him that a woman could travel 3 days through hostile country to negotiate peace, and then be expected to stand through the whole affair like a servant. He did not think much more of it that night. He delivered his flour. helped stack the last of the firewood for the tavern's ovens, and walked the muddy road back to the mill beneath a sky still weeping thin rain, his mind already turning over tomorrow's grinding schedule. He did not know, not yet, that Urzoth Earthshaker had watched him the entire length of his walk from the shadow beneath the bell's dripping eave, or that she had already decided, with the same unhurried certainty she brought to every decision that mattered, that she intended to know this small, stubborn, flour-dusted man a great deal better before her business in Crossmill was done. The negotiation stretched across the following days like a slow-drawn thread, snagging on every old wound the war had left behind. The council wanted assurances about raiding parties. Urzoth wanted assurances about the return of Ashfang land seized during the fighting. There were arguments over grazing rights along the border hills, over the safe passage of orc traders through human towns, over 100 small cruelties that neither side wanted to be first to forgive. Through it all, Urzoth sat in her borrowed chair at the head of the table, and through it all, Amos found reasons to be nearby. It was not difficult. The Crossroads Bell's innkeeper, flustered by the presence of an Orc Envoy under his roof, and unwilling to risk offending either the council or his paying human guests, had quietly informed Urzoth on the second night that her usual room had been given by mistake to a merchant party from the coast, and that regrettably there was nowhere else fit for her to stay. It was a lie, and everyone at the table knew it was a lie, including Urzoth herself, who simply looked at the innkeeper with such flat, weary contempt that the man found something urgent to attend to in his cellar. It was Amos who spoke up, again without meaning to become the sort of man who spoke up at treaty tables. "There's a room above my mill," he said. "It was my father's before he and my mother moved to the cottage down the lane. It's clean, it's dry, and the wheel makes a fair sound to fall asleep to once you're used to it." Magistrate Hale looked scandalized. One of the other councilmen muttered something about propriety that Amos chose not to hear clearly. Urzoth simply studied him across the table, that same unhurried, assessing look she had given the borrowed chair, and then nodded once. "I have slept in worse places than a miller's loft," she said. "I accept." And so it was that the Orc Envoy of the Ashfang clan came to lodge above Rhodes' mill for the remainder of the treaty talks, and Amos Rhodes found his quiet, unremarkable life turned suddenly and irrevocably strange. She moved through his mill the way she seemed to move through everything, with a contained power that made small spaces feel smaller, and made Amos acutely aware of every clumsy, human-sized thing he owned. She ducked beneath the low doorframe without complaint. She studied the great turning wheel through the open sluice window with open curiosity, watching the water catch the paddles and drive the shaft that turned the stones below. "This is how you feed your people," she said the first night, standing at the window with the spray misting her face. "Not with swords, with water and stone and patience." "It's not as exciting as a war camp, I'd guess," Amos said, setting a bowl of stew on the small table for her, the same stew he ate himself because he had nothing finer to offer and did not think to apologize for it. "No," Urzoth agreed. She sat, testing the chair's sturdiness before trusting her weight to it fully, an old habit he would learn, born of too many human-built things collapsing under orc-sized weight. "It is better. My people fought this war because our lands were taken and our dead were dishonored. But I have watched enough men die for pride and enough children starve for want of exactly this," she gestured at the turning wheel outside, "to know which one is worth defending." They talked long into that first night, and the nights that followed, while the treaty argued itself in circles down at the bell each day, and Amos ground what little grain came to him each evening after the negotiations broke. She told him of her clan, the Ashfang, of the mountain passes they called home before the war pushed them back into harder country, of her mother who had led the clan's war band before Urzoth herself had taken up the role, of the losses that had made her, at only 26, both younger and more scarred than most envoys sent to speak for their people. He told her of the mill, of his father's failing hands, of the slow strangling of a town that had once been busy and was now only waiting, and of the particular loneliness of being the man everyone relied upon and no one really saw. "They see you," Urzoth said one night, watching him across the small table with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged as a coming storm. "I saw you, the first night. While every man with rank and title sat arguing about chairs, you were the only one who understood there was a person sitting in the empty space, not a problem to be managed." "I didn't do anything special," Amos said, uncomfortable beneath the weight of her attention in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You brought a chair into a room full of men who would rather have let me stand for 100 years than admit I deserved a place among them," she said. "That is not nothing, Miller. That is the rarest thing I have found in this whole miserable crossroads." She reached across the table then and took his hand, turning it over in her own much larger one, tracing the calluses that ridged his palm from years of hauling grain sacks and hand-cranking the hopper. Her fingers were rough too, warrior's hands, scarred across the knuckles, but there was nothing rough in the way she touched him, slow and deliberate, as though memorizing the shape of something she had decided already to keep. "Strength earned through labor," she murmured, "not through killing. I did not know I wanted such a thing until I felt it." Amos's breath caught somewhere in his chest. He did not pull his hand away, though every instinct born of a lifetime of being overlooked told him this could not possibly be real, that a woman like Urzoth Earthshaker, who could have chosen the strongest, boldest warrior of any clan, would not be sitting in his father's old chair with his rough hand held in both of hers as though it were something precious. "I'm just a miller, Urzoth," he said quietly. "There's nothing special about me." "You keep saying that," she said, "as though it will convince me to believe it. It will not." She lifted his hand and pressed it briefly against the side of her face, against skin that was warm and solid and far softer than he had expected, and Amos felt something in his chest crack open that he had kept sealed for a very long time, some door he had not even realized he was still holding shut. "I have met kings who were smaller men than you, Amos Rhodes. Do not tell me again what you are not." Neither of them moved to close the last small distance between them that night, though it hummed in the air like the mill race itself, a current both of them could feel, and neither was yet ready to name. But something had already begun, quiet and inevitable as the turning of the wheel, and both of them knew it. The attack came on the 5th night of the treaty talks, on the eastern stretch of road, where the crossroads track wound down through a stand of black pine before opening onto the mill's fields, and it came without warning beneath a sky torn open by a sudden hammering rain. Amos had gone out with the wagon to collect the last delivery of barley from a farmstead 2 miles east, later than he should have risked with the negotiations still so fragile. But the family needed the coin, and he had not wanted to turn them away. Urzoth had insisted on riding with him, over his protests that an envoy had no business escorting a grain wagon, with an argument that ended the discussion before it began. "I did not travel 3 days through country that wanted me dead to sit idle in a loft while you ride alone into the dark, Miller. This is not a request." The bandits struck as the wagon crossed the narrows where the road dipped between 2 steep banks, a dozen riders bursting from the tree line with torches doused and blades drawn, men in mismatched armor who fought for no lord and answered to no law but their own profit. Amos recognized their leader by reputation alone, a broad-shouldered mercenary named Garrick Vane who had made a fortune during the war years running contraband and worse through the contested borderlands, a man who stood to lose everything the moment peace reopened the roads to honest trade. "No treaty tonight, Miller," Vane called out, his voice carrying easily over the drumming rain as his men circled the wagon. "Can't have it. Not with my business riding on the war staying good and hot." Amos had no sword. He had a hand axe kept beneath the wagon seat for clearing fallen branches, and he had barely gotten his fingers around its haft before a rider bore down on him with a torch swung like a club. He threw himself sideways off the wagon, hit the mud hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs, and rolled beneath the wagon's belly as hooves thundered past where his head had been a heartbeat before. Urzoth was already moving. She came off the wagon bench in a single fluid motion, her sword clearing its sheath before her boots touched the ground, and the first bandit who reached her never had the chance to regret it. She fought the way she did everything, with total, unhesitating commitment, cutting through the rain-slicked dark with a fury that scattered 3 riders back before they understood what they had ridden into. But there were a dozen of them and only one of her, and Amos saw, with a cold spike of terror that eclipsed every other thought in his head, a rider circling wide behind her, bow already drawn, arrow nocked and aimed at the unguarded space between her shoulder blades. He did not think. He would tell himself later that a braver man might have planned something, but in that moment there was no plan at all, only the animal certainty that he could not let that arrow fly, and he came up from beneath the wagon with the hand axe already swinging, driving his shoulder into the archer's horse hard enough to spoil the shot. The arrow went wide, hissing into the mud, and the archer turned on him with a snarl, but the moment's distraction was enough. Urzoth spun, saw the archer bearing down on the man who had just saved her life, and closed the distance in 3 strides, her blade taking the rider from his saddle before he could nock a second arrow. "Behind you!" Amos shouted, and she turned again, faster this time, catching a descending blade on her own with a shock that rang out over the rain, and it was Amos's turn to move, throwing himself at the bandit's stirrup and hauling with every ounce of strength his miller's arms possessed until the man crashed from his horse into the mud. Urzoth finished it a heartbeat later. The fight, once Vayne realized his men were paying too high a price for a job that had promised easy coin, broke apart as quickly as it had begun. Vayne himself wheeled his horse and vanished back into the black pines with his remaining riders, shouting something about another night, and then the road was quiet again, except for the rain and the ragged, gasping breath of the 2 people left standing in the mud beside an overturned wagon of scattered barley. Urzoth turned to him first, and there was something wild and unguarded in her face that Amos had not seen before, not the composed authority of the treaty table, but something rawer. "You stood beneath an archer's arrow for me," she said, and her voice shook just slightly in a way that told him how rare it was for her voice to shake at all. "You'd already saved my life twice by then," Amos said, still catching his breath, still trembling with the aftershock of violence he had never trained for and had somehow survived anyway. Seemed only fair. She closed the distance between them in 2 strides and caught his face in both her hands, hands that had just killed men and now held him with a gentleness that made his throat ache. And she kissed him with a hunger that had clearly been building for 5 days, and had finally found an excuse it could no longer ignore. Amos froze for one startled heartbeat and then kissed her back, his hands coming up to grip her forearms, steadying himself against a woman who could have crushed him without effort, and instead held him like something she was terrified of losing. When she finally drew back, her forehead resting against his, both of them breathing hard, rain running in rivulets down both their faces, she said, low and rough, "In my clan, when a warrior chooses a mate, she does not wait for him to work up the courage to ask. She claims him before witnesses so that no one may ever doubt where his loyalty lies or where hers does. Is that what you're doing?" Amos asked, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain she could hear it. "I am telling you what is coming," Urzoth said. "I am not a patient woman about the things I want, Miller, and I have wanted you since you carried a chair across a rain-soaked courtyard for a woman you owed nothing." Her thumb traced the line of his jaw, and her voice softened, the fierceness giving way to something achingly tender. "But I would have you choose it too. I will not claim a man who has not chosen me back." "I chose you the moment you told me you'd remember my face," Amos said, and meant every word of it. She kissed him again, softer this time, and beneath the drumming rain and the wreckage of an ambush that had nearly killed them both, something settled into place between them that neither the war nor the treaty nor anyone in Crossmill would be able to unmake. They righted the wagon between them, gathered what barley could be salvaged from the mud, and rode back to the mill in a silence that was not uncomfortable, her hand resting warm over his where he held the reins the entire way. Not everyone in Crossmill welcomed what grew, over the following days, into an openly acknowledged bond between the miller and the Orc Envoy. Word of the ambush spread fast, and with it, word of how the two of them had fought back to back and ridden home hand in hand. And while some villagers found in the story a reason for hope, others found in it only a fresh wound to old prejudice. It came to a head 3 evenings later in the common room of the Crossroads Bell, crowded that night with farmers and travelers who had come in from the rain to drink and trade gossip about the treaty. Urzoth had come down from the mill to meet Amos after the day's negotiations, still dressed in her fitted travel leathers with her cloak thrown back, and her presence in the doorway silenced the room the way it always did, though not always kindly. "Didn't take her long to find herself a new pet, did it?" a voice said from a corner table, loud enough to carry, belonging to a grain trader named Dobbs who had lost a brother in the border fighting and had never made any secret of where his sympathies lay. Thought the miller had more pride than that. The room went very still. Amos felt heat rise up the back of his neck, not from embarrassment but from something closer to fury, and he set down his mug and rose from his chair, but Urzoth's hand on his shoulder stopped him before he could cross the room. "Let him speak, if he has more to say," she said, and her voice carried easily to Dobbs's table without her needing to raise it at all. "I have been called worse by braver men." Dobbs, emboldened by drink or by the murmur of agreement from a couple of his companions, pushed back from his table and stood. Braver men knew enough to keep their distance from a monster wearing a woman's shape. "Whatever you've done to bewitch him, Miller, I hope it was worth." He did not finish the sentence, because Amos had crossed the room before Urzoth could stop him this time, and though he did not raise a fist, he planted himself squarely between Dobbs and the door with a look on his face that the trader had clearly never expected to see from the quiet, unremarkable miller. "You lost a brother," Amos said, low and steady, "and I am sorry for that loss truly. I lost customers and half a town's future to the same war. But this woman rode into an ambush meant to kill us both and never once hesitated to put herself between me and an arrow, and if that makes her a monster in your eyes, then I have no more use for your opinion, Dobbs, and neither does anyone else with sense enough to see what's standing in front of them." The room held its breath. Dobbs's face reddened, his jaw working, but whatever retort he had been building crumbled beneath the sheer, unshaken calm of a man who had clearly already made peace with whatever it cost him to say it. He sat back down without another word, and the murmur of the tavern slowly resumed around them, quieter than before, chastened. Urzoth said nothing until they were outside again, the rain having eased to a fine mist that beaded silver on her leathers and in the loose strands of hair that had escaped her braids. Then she turned to him, took his face in her hands as she had that first night on the road, and studied him with an expression he had not yet learned to name, though he would come to know it very well in the months ahead, fierce, possessive, wondering. "You did not need to defend me," she said. "I have survived worse insults than a grain trader's cowardice." "I know you didn't need it," Amos said. "I wasn't doing it for you. I was doing it because I couldn't stand there and listen to it, not about you, not anymore." He hesitated, then added quieter, "I love you, Urzoth. I don't know when it happened exactly, but it has, and I'm not ashamed of it, whatever Dobbs or anyone else thinks." Something in her amber eyes softened into something almost fragile, a crack in the warrior's composure that she let him see because she trusted him to see it. "I have led war bands, Amos Rhodes. I have negotiated with clan chiefs who would sooner cut out their own tongues than yield a point of pride. I have never once in 26 years told a man that I loved him, because I never found one worth the risk of it." She pressed her forehead to his, her voice dropping to something almost too soft for her deep voice to carry. "I love you, and I do not intend to let a grain trader or a treaty or the whole width of the world keep me from claiming what is mine. The relic, when it finally entered the story in earnest, did so on the seventh day of negotiations, at a moment when the treaty itself seemed almost within reach of a final signature. It was Urzoth who raised the matter formally at the treaty table, though Amos had heard her speak of it before, in quieter tones, during their nights above the mill. The Earthheart stone, a fist-sized talisman of dark river stone carved by her clan's ancestors, and set with a vein of pale quartz that was said to hold the voices of the Ashfang dead, looted from a mountain shrine during a human raid 7 years past, in the bloodiest year of the war. Its return, Urzoth told the council, was not merely a demand but a condition, a proof that this peace was meant sincerely and not simply as a pause before the next betrayal. "We do not ask for gold," she said, standing at the table though her chair remained, solid and rightfully hers, beside her. "We do not ask for land beyond what was already ours. We ask for the return of what was stolen from our dead. Without it, no treaty signed by human hands will ever be trusted by Ashfang hearts." Magistrate Hale, sweating despite the evening chill, admitted that the council had no knowledge of where such a relic might currently be kept, that whatever soldier had carried it home from that raid had likely sold it or lost it or died with it years ago, and that finding it now, 7 years and 100 battles later, seemed an impossible task. It was Amos, sitting quietly near the back of the courtyard as he had every evening since the first, who remembered something that made his blood run suddenly cold. He had grown up hearing his father speak, rarely and reluctantly, of the years he had spent as a young man in the border militia before the worst of the fighting began, years he never discussed in detail and clearly wished to forget. Amos had always assumed it was simply the ordinary silence of a man who had seen war and did not care to relive it. But he remembered now a locked chest in the old cottage where his parents had retired, a chest his father had always kept beneath his bed and never once opened in Amos's presence. And he remembered with a sick lurch of understanding a strange dark stone he had glimpsed as a boy of 10, sneaking a look inside that chest while his father slept, a stone with a vein of pale quartz running through it like a frozen river. He said nothing at the table. He waited until the evening session broke, until Urzoth had returned with him to the mill, and only then, sitting across the small table from her with his hands twisted together in his lap, did he tell her what he suspected. "It might be nothing," he said. "It might be some other stone entirely, some trinket he picked up as a boy. I don't want to give your people false hope, and I don't," he stopped, throat tight. "I don't want you to look at me differently, knowing my own father might have been the one who took it." Urzoth was quiet for a long moment, studying him across the table with an expression that held none of the anger he had feared. "Your father fought in a war he did not start," she said finally. "If he took the stone, he took it as a soldier following orders in a war that made monsters of good men on both sides. That is not a sin that belongs to you, Amos Rhodes, and I will not hold you responsible for the hands of a man now years in his grave." She reached across the table and took his hand, the same gesture that had first cracked open his careful, guarded heart. "But if it is there, it must be returned, not for the treaty, for the dead who have waited 7 years to be heard again." They rode out to the cottage the next morning, and Amos, with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the ride, explained to his mother, still sharp-eyed and quick despite her years, what they had come looking for. She did not seem surprised. She led them without a word to the chest beneath the bed, unlocked it with a key she had kept hidden all these years, and there, wrapped in a moth-eaten cloth at the very bottom, lay the Earthheart stone, its quartz vein catching the morning light with a faint, uncanny shimmer. "He never told me where it came from," Amos's mother said quietly, watching Urzoth lift the stone with hands that trembled, for the first time since Amos had known her, with something other than battle readiness. "Only that he could not bring himself to sell it, and could not bring himself to keep it either. I think it haunted him more than he ever let on. It haunted him because it was never his to keep, Urzoth said, but there was no cruelty in her voice, only a deep, aching gratitude. She turned to Amos, and her eyes were bright with tears she did not bother to hide. You have given my clan back 7 years of grief they did not know how to put down. There is no debt greater than that, Miller, none that I know how to repay. You don't owe me anything, Amos said. I just wanted to see it made right. She kissed him then in front of his startled mother without a trace of shame, and his mother, after a moment of wide-eyed surprise, only laughed softly and said she supposed she ought to put the kettle on. The stone's recovery should have been the final obstacle standing between the treaty and its signing. Instead, it became the very thing that nearly destroyed everything both of them had fought to build. Word of the Earthheart Stone's return spread through Crossmill within a day, as such news always did in a town small enough that every secret eventually found its way to every ear. Garrick Vane heard it too, wherever he had gone to ground after the failed ambush, and he understood with the cold clarity of a man who had built his fortune on war that a signed treaty would mean the end of every profitable thing he had left. He could not stop the treaty with swords again. The ambush had cost him men and taught the council to double their guard on the roads. So he chose, instead, a subtler and far crueler weapon. The stone was kept in the days before the final signing in a locked strongbox within the treaty tent itself, guarded day and night by both human soldiers and 2 of Urzoth's own honor guard. On the 9th night, in the black hours before dawn, someone slipped past that guard, picked the strongbox's lock, and vanished with the stone into the dark, leaving behind, deliberately and unmistakably, a torn scrap of ashfang-patterned cloth snagged on the strongbox's hinge, and a set of muddy tracks leading directly toward the mill. By the time the sun rose over Crossmill, the entire town was awake and afire with the news. The sacred relic, so recently and so movingly returned, had been stolen again, and all the evidence pointed toward the Orc Envoy herself, or toward the miller who had sheltered her, or toward both of them together, conspiring to make a mockery of the very peace they claimed to want. Amos woke to the sound of fists pounding on the mill's door and the low, ugly murmur of a crowd gathering outside, a sound he recognized from stories his father had told of wartime justice, swift and merciless, and rarely troubled by the inconvenience of proof. They dragged Urzoth from the mill loft before Amos could do more than pull on his boots, 4 guardsmen who would not meet her eyes as they bound her wrists, and Magistrate Hale, pale and shaking with a fear that made him dangerous, declared before the assembled crowd that the old border law still stood, the wartime statute that granted summary justice against enemy agents caught in treachery, and that the Crossroads gallows, built years ago and never yet used for want of a proper occasion, would see its first execution before noon. Amos ran the whole way to the Crossroads Square, his lungs burning, his mind screaming denial with every stride, and arrived to find the entire town of Crossmill gathered in a great, restless ring around a raised wooden platform where the old gallows stood, its beam gray and weathered but its rope newly strung, taut and terrible in the pale morning light. Urzoth stood upon that platform with her wrists bound before her, her chin lifted, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her afraid, though Amos, close enough now to see her face clearly, saw something in her amber eyes that was not fear exactly, but something worse. Resignation, the terrible calm of a warrior who had accepted that this might simply be how her story ended, betrayed not by an enemy's blade but by the very peace she had come to build. "Stop!" Amos shouted, shoving through the crowd with a strength born entirely of desperation. "Stop this! You have the wrong." "Stand back, Miller," Magistrate Hale called from beside the platform, his voice cracking with the strain of pretending authority he did not feel. "The law is clear. Enemy treachery against a treaty in progress carries the old sentence, and the evidence is not in dispute. Her own clan's markings were found at the scene. evidence that anyone could have planted. Amos shouted back, but the crowd's murmur had already hardened into something ugly and certain, fear and old grief finding, at last, an outlet they had been waiting 7 years to release. A guardsman moved toward the lever that would open the platform's trap beneath the noose, and Urzoth was led forward, her bound hands unable to steady herself as she was positioned beneath the rope, and Amos felt the world narrow down to a single, unbearable point of terror. He did the only thing he could think to do. He ran. He hit the base of the platform steps at a dead sprint, shoving past a startled guard, and vaulted up onto the wooden planking just as the executioner's hand closed around the lever. "Wait!" he bellowed, with a volume he had not known his voice could produce, and something in the raw desperation of it made even the executioner hesitate, his hand frozen on the lever, the entire courtyard falling into a stunned, ringing silence. "I have proof," Amos said, gasping for breath, standing now between Urzoth and the drop, close enough that he could have reached out and touched the rope that hung inches from her throat. "I have proof it wasn't her, and if you kill her before you hear it, you will have murdered an innocent woman and burned this treaty to ash along with her, and every man, woman, and child in this town will starve for it when the roads stay closed for another 10 years. You have had all night to invent whatever story Hale began." "I have had all night," Amos cut across him, "because I spent it riding to the old watchtower ruins north of the crossroads, where I have twice now seen Garrick Vane's smugglers keeping their contraband, and I found this." He reached into his coat and drew out a battered leather satchel, and from it, held high enough for the whole crowd to see, the unmistakable dark shape of the Earthheart stone, its pale quartz vein catching the morning sun. The crowd's murmur broke into a wave of astonished noise. Magistrate Hale's mouth opened and closed without sound. "I found it hidden with a half-dozen other stolen goods, and I found this alongside it," Amos continued, pulling a second item from the satchel, a signet ring stamped with a crude device Amos had seen before, stitched into the collar of the coat Garrick Vane had worn the night of the ambush. "Vane's own men left it behind in their haste to run when they heard me coming." He planted the cloth scrap and the tracks to point at Urzoth, because a treaty means the end of every crooked coin he's made off this war, and he was counting on this town's fear to do the rest of the work for him. The silence that followed was total. Urzoth, still standing beneath the noose with her wrists bound, looked at Amos with an expression that no crowd, no treaty, no war could ever have prepared him for, something that went beyond gratitude into a realm of raw, disbelieving devotion. "He risked his life to prove it," she said, her voice carrying clear and strong across the courtyard, addressing the crowd directly now. "Not because he owed me anything, but because he believed I deserved the truth before your rope. Ask yourselves what kind of enemy inspires that kind of courage in an ordinary man, and ask yourselves whether the fear you have carried for 7 years is worth more than the eyes in front of you." Magistrate Hale, his authority crumbling visibly with every passing second, finally found his voice. "Cut her bonds," he said, hoarse. "Someone find Vane before he flees the district. This execution is stayed pending a full accounting." It took only a moment for a guard to sever the ropes at Urzoth's wrists, and the instant she was free, she turned and pulled Amos into her arms in front of the entire gathered town, holding him with a fierceness that told him more clearly than any words how close she had believed her end to be, and how completely his arrival had rewritten it. Amos held her back just as tightly, his whole body trembling now that the danger had passed and left him nothing to do but feel the terror of it in full. "You stood beneath my own gallows for me," she murmured into his hair, her voice rough. "You are either the bravest man I have ever known or the greatest fool, and I no longer care which, because you are mine either way." "I told you I chose you," Amos said against her shoulder. "I meant it." Garrick Vane was captured before sundown, run to ground trying to flee south along a smuggler's trail with 3 of his men, and a wagon full of stolen goods that matched, item for item, half the unsolved thefts that had plagued Crossmill for the better part of a year. He offered no confession of loyalty to anyone, only cursed the treaty and everyone who had brought it about. But the ring, the cloth, and the testimony of two frightened villagers who had seen him near the treaty tent the night of the theft were more than enough. He was bound over for trial under the very law he had nearly used to hang an innocent woman, and Crossmill, for the first time in 7 years, breathed a little easier knowing the man who had profited from its suffering would profit from it no longer. The treaty was signed 3 days later, in the same courtyard where it had so nearly ended in tragedy, though this time the crossroads square had been transformed. Word had spread of everything that had happened: the ambush, the recovered relic, the near execution, and the truth that had unraveled it at the final second. And the crowd that gathered that morning came not out of fear or suspicion, but out of something closer to hope, drawn by a story already passing into the town's own folklore. At the head of the long table, beside the 6 carved chairs of the human council, stood a 7th seat, and it was no longer a borrowed dining chair from the tavern's private room. The town's carpenter, moved by the story of the ambush and the gallows and everything between, had spent 2 days building it fresh. A high-backed chair of dark oak, carved along its arms with a pattern of mountain stone and river water intertwined, as fine as any seat at that table and finer than most. A chair built specifically, deliberately, to say that the woman who sat in it belonged there as surely as anyone else. Urzoth stood before it for a long moment before she sat, running her hand along the carved arm, and when she looked up, she found Amos watching her from the edge of the crowd, and she held his gaze as she lowered herself into the seat that was, at last, entirely and rightfully her own. "Now," she said, and there was a warmth in her voice that had not been there on that first stormy night, "I will sign." The quills scratched against parchment beneath a sky finally clear of rain, and when the last signature was set, a cheer went up from the crowd that had, only days before, been ready to watch this same woman hang. Urzoth rose from her chair, and instead of turning to accept the congratulations of the council, she walked directly through the crowd to where Amos stood, and the entire courtyard fell quiet again, sensing, correctly, that they were about to witness something as significant as the treaty itself. She stopped before him and reached into a pouch at her belt, drawing out a length of braided leather cord, dark and supple, worked through with small beads of pale bone that matched the ones in her own hair, and at its center hung a tiny carved token shaped like a stone split by a vein of quartz, a miniature echo of the very relic that had nearly cost her life. "Among my people," she said, her voice carrying clear across the silent square, addressing not only Amos but every soul gathered to watch, human and orc alike. "When a warrior finds the one she means to claim as hers before all the world, she does not ask quietly in private, where no one will ever know the truth of her heart. She declares it before witnesses, so that no doubt, no prejudice, no fear can ever unmake it." She held the cord out toward him, her hand steady despite the vulnerability written plain across her face. "Amos Rhodes, miller of Crossmill, you carried a chair across a courtyard for a woman you owed nothing. You stood beneath my own gallows and stopped a rope from taking my life with nothing but truth and courage to arm you. You have given my dead their voice back and my heart something it never expected to find in this lifetime. I am claiming you before my people and yours as mine. Will you yield to it?" The old custom, she had told him once, above the mill in the quiet of a rain-soft night. The man who accepted such a claiming did not simply nod or speak a word of assent. He knelt, and he clasped the offering hand in the warrior's grip, forearm to forearm, and in doing so declared himself not conquered but chosen, an equal partner freely giving what she had freely offered to take. Amos did not hesitate. He crossed the last few feet between them and sank to one knee on the rain-damp cobblestones of the crossroads square, and he took her offered forearm in his own, gripping it as she gripped his in return. And the crowd around them, human and orc alike, erupted into a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a gasp, something wondering and unprecedented, the sound of an old world's boundaries quietly, permanently redrawing themselves. "I yield," Amos said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer had any reason to hide. "I choose you, Urzoth Earthshaker. I have chosen you since the first night you told me you'd remember my face, and I will go on choosing you every day you'll have me." She pulled him to his feet and looped the braided cord over his head herself, settling the small carved stone against his chest with a tenderness that seemed almost at odds with the ferocity of everything that had come before. And then she kissed him, fully and unashamedly, before the whole assembled crowd of Crossmill, before the council, before her own honor guard, before every prejudice either of their peoples had ever carried into that square. And none of it mattered anymore. None of it could touch what had grown. Fast and fierce and entirely real, between a miller who had never expected to be chosen by anyone, and a warrior who had never expected to want to choose anyone at all. The Eastern Road reopened within the month, and grain wagons began, slowly at first and then with growing confidence, to roll once more along the crossroads track toward Rhodes Mill, where the great wheel turned day and night beneath a sky no longer haunted by the smoke of raids. The crossroads bell filled again with travelers and traders, human and orc both, drawn by a peace that had been forged not in the abstract language of treaties alone, but in the plain, undeniable proof of two people who had refused to let fear decide what was possible between them. Urzoth did not return to her clan's mountains when her envoy's duties concluded. She stayed, as she had promised she would, dividing her days between the diplomatic work that still remained to be done, smoothing the countless small frictions of a peace still finding its footing, and the quiet, ordinary hours she spent at the mill beside the man who had carried a chair across a courtyard for her, and never once, in all the danger and doubt that followed, given her cause to regret trusting him with her heart. On a clear evening some weeks after the signing, with the wheel turning steady and low outside the mill's open window and the last light of sunset gilding the water gold, Urzoth found Amos exactly where she always found him at the day's end, sleeves rolled to the elbow, flour dusting his forearms, humming some tuneless thing to himself as he swept the grinding floor clean. She came up behind him without a sound, wrapped her arms around him from behind, and rested her chin atop his head, and Amos leaned back into her without breaking his rhythm, entirely unsurprised, entirely at home in the strength that surrounded him. "I have led war bands across 3 mountain ranges," she murmured against his hair, "and negotiated peace with men who would rather have died than yield a single point. I never once, in all of it, felt as certain of anything as I feel standing here, in a mill that smells of flour and rain, with a man who is worth more than every treaty I have ever signed." Amos turned in her arms to face her, reaching up to trace the curve of a tusk, a gesture that had once felt impossibly foreign and now felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Then stay," he said simply, "not because the treaty needs you here, because I do." "I was never going to leave, Miller," Urzoth said, and there was no fierceness in it now, only a warmth as steady and enduring as the wheel turning behind them, as the water that never stopped flowing, as the love that had begun with an empty chair at a rain-soaked table and had grown, against every prejudice and every danger the crossroads could throw at it, into something neither of them would ever again have to face alone. "You gave me a seat when the world said I did not belong at your table. I intend to keep the one you have given me at your side for the rest of my days." She kissed him then, slow and certain, with the wheel turning steady outside and the whole wide, healing world stretched out before them, and Amos Rhodes, once the most overlooked man in Crossmill, held the fiercest, most magnificent woman he had ever known, and understood at last exactly what it meant to be chosen.